Velkommen til Krimfestivalen. Nå skal vi møte en herremann som kanskje vår tids største forfatter når det kommer til spionasje, kontraspionasje, den kalde krigen og forbløffende operasjoner under andre verdenskrig. Her hjemme kjenner mange han som forfatteren bak bøker som Spion og Forræder eller Agent Zigzag, og fans av litteratur om kald krig, eller bare krig, kjenner han sikkert via Double Cross og Operation Mincemeat. Nå han aktuell på norsk med nok en vill og grundig researchet historie om den tyske superspionen Ursula Kosinski, Agent Sonya. So, it is an honor to welcome you to Oslo Crime Festival, Mr. Ben Macintyre. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Let's just, we have 20 minutes for this, so let's just go directly to Agent Sonya, the new book which is published in Norwegian. Ursula Kosinski, Agent Sonya, how would you describe her for someone who's never heard of this mystery woman, the great spy of World War II?
Well, one of the fascinating things is that we have not hitherto known very much about Ursula. She's hidden from history, partly because she was a woman. I mean, the fact is she's been overlooked, but her life was absolutely extraordinary. She was a communist intelligence officer who worked for the Soviet Union for more than 10 years. She rose to become a colonel in the Red Army intelligence service. There is no woman in any intelligence service that I've ever come across in any country who ever rose that high. So she is phenomenal. She spied in Germany, in Nazi Germany. She spied in China against the nationalist government there. She spied in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, Poland, Switzerland, and then ended up in Britain, just in the middle of the war. And if you had met her in the 1940s in Britain, you would have met a perfectly ordinary English housewife with 3 children, baking scones in her little house in the rural Oxfordshire countryside. But in fact, in the outside toilet in the back garden, she had built a very powerful radio transmitter with which she was sending the secrets of the atomic bomb to Moscow. She's one of the very few spies I've ever come across who had a dramatic impact on the course of history, and yet she's been completely hidden from sight for all these years. It's a remarkable story, and she herself is a pretty extraordinary figure.
How did you stumble over her story? As you said, we don't know much about her before we read Agent Sonya, before you wrote it. Where did you hear about her for the first time?
It was pure accident. I can't claim it was any great brilliance on my part. I was researching a very different story in a very different part of the world. I was looking at American operations in Britain at the end of the war, and this shadowy figure appeared in the background. She wasn't even known by her name at that point. She was only known as Agent Sonya. And I began to dig around, and I found this incredible wealth of material, really, largely through her family. 2 of her 3 children were still alive, living in East Germany. And they offered me, after a little while, they gave me full access to her archive, which included letters and diaries and postcards and poems and thousands of photographs, which no one had ever read before, including the family. And that was really the key to it. And then I found this amazing archive, not just in Britain, in the intelligence archives in Britain, but the Stasi in East Germany, where she had spent the latter part of her life, had kept files on Ursula Kosinski, even though she was one of them. She was a fully paid up communist. And those proved incredibly useful because the Stasi, say what you like about the Stasi, but they kept wonderful files. Their files are extremely voluminous and very revealing about Ursula's life. So with that combination of elements, I was able to go right back to the beginning and find this extraordinary life that sort of started in sort of Germany between the wars and spans the whole of communism. I mean, Ursula was a convinced communist. I mean, she was all her life, from the age of 17, she believed in the communist cause. But she was very young when the Bolshevik Revolution took place. And she was very old when the Berlin Wall came down. And so her story, in some ways, covers the whole of communism, from its kind of ideological beginnings to its chaotic ending. So it's a way of looking at the whole of communism.
She's been described as Stalin's best spy ever. When you researched her for your book, when you dug into these Stasi files and all the materials you found, what was the most surprising thing you found?
Well, the most extraordinary thing I found in the Stasi files was when Ursula, and I don't want to give the story away for your readers, but when she escaped back to East Germany from the West, she stopped being a spy, but she did become a writer. She became a very famous children's novelist under a completely different name. But in the late 1970s, she was given permission to write her memoir as a spy. And this she did. And she submitted a kind of handwritten manuscript to the Stasi for their approval. And the Stasi took one look at this document and said, well, you can't possibly publish this because it's too revealing. You know, it tells us everything about your spy time and your love affairs. She had 3 children by 3 different men. And they said, you can't publish it. But they allowed her eventually to publish a kind of censored version. But being the Stasi, they kept the original version. So the uncensored version is in the Stasi archives. So I was able to extract that and reveal all the stuff that the Stasi didn't want you to know about, which was a huge breakthrough. I mean, the other great surprise about Ursula Kaczynski is that she was a communist and a properly ideological, committed communist. And so in some ways, I was rather nervous of taking this project on because communists can be fantastically boring. I mean, they can lecture you about dialectic materialism, you know, and tell you which way is the right way and which way is the path of righteousness. But actually, Ursula turned out to be, for several years, I studied this, you know, researched it, a really fascinating and entertaining companion. She's actually she's a very amusing, tough, clever, very witty, very resourceful. She's not at all what you would imagine as a kind of didactic communist. She's actually great fun, Ursula. She's very naughty. I mean, you know, for somebody who kind of spied in this really dangerous way for decades, she's actually a terrific personality, which is why I loved writing the book in the end.
She said after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the communist regime in DDR that she never regretted her political views as a communist, and she also felt a little bit sad about Die Wende, also when the reunification of West and East Germany. Having researched and written about her life, do you understand her?
I understand her. That's such a good question. I understand the context in which she lived, I think. I mean, I think in order to understand someone like Ursula, you have to realize that she embraced communism at a time in the 1920s and 30s in Germany when fascism was on the march. The brown shirts were taking over. Hitler and his thugs were coming to power. And Ursula believed and maintained for the rest of her life that the only way to oppose fascism was communism. And so she embraced it in a way that I think, well, many people in Europe did at the time, and many might today, faced with the rise of appalling fascism, this anti-Semitic scourge that was going to destroy most of her family. So she comes in a way from a rather pure place. In the course of her life, though, of course, Stalinism became an appalling, brutal, repressive regime. And I think, although she distanced herself from Stalin, I mean, she said in the end, I never did what I did for Stalin. I did it for the idea. I did it for the workers. I did it for the cause. And she maintained the purity of that idea right to the end. She was disillusioned. I mean, she came to realize in later life, particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, she came to realize that many of the truths, many of the ideological certainties that she had clung to all her life were lies, and that the regime that she had supported all her life was in many ways corrupted and brutal and criminal. But she always maintained that she didn't do it for Stalin. That people made mistakes, but that the idea was a good idea. But that said, she died a disillusioned woman. And I think in a way that makes her story terribly interesting, because we tend to look back on history as if it is black or white, good or evil. People are either on the right side of history or the wrong side of history. And Ursula, you have to understand her in context. I'm not making an apology for her beliefs. I don't share them. I'm not even making a kind of excuse for her life. I think her life was very, very complicated. But to understand communism, you have to see it through its enormous and in some ways magnificent history. It is one of the most important thought ideologies that we've ever had. And so instead of simply dismissing it all as wrong, you need to understand it. And I hope I've done a bit of that.
When you talk about where Ursula's communism comes from, there has been, like in recent years, a renewed interest in this era, the Weimar Republic, in between First and Second World War.
Yeah.
You have the series Babylon Berlin. The publishing house Taschen has published coffee tables about events and venues and people from this era. Why do you think this era seems to capture the spotlight again and again and again and creates this enormous interest?
I think it was the Weimar Republic was really the crucible of everything else that happened in the 20th century. It's the place where you have the most violent collision between left and right. You have the extreme right on the march, and you have the extreme left on the march. Many people, Ursula included, believed that the next revolution after the Bolshevik Revolution would take place in Germany. And she was not alone in believing that. There were hundreds of thousands, millions of people who supported the far left as the only defense, if you like, against the rise of fascism. And bear in mind that, of course, when the Spanish Civil War was in full flow, when you had this obvious collision between the Soviet-backed Republicans and the Nazi-backed nationalist regime, people believed that ideological choices were going to change the way the world worked. And that comes to a head in Weimar. Ursula she came from a wealthy Jewish, intellectual, academic family. And yet every day when she went to work in her bookshop, she would see the effects of extreme poverty wherever she was. So it was in some ways, I think, the contrast between her, at that point, very comfortable life, which would be utterly destroyed by the Nazis within a few years. But it was the contrast between that and what she saw every day that really pushed her towards revolution, I think.
You mention it often in your book that she was able to operate freely because she was a woman, a mother as well as a spy. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because, I mean, how out of place as a spy, how unusual was Ursula Koszynski in the 30s and the 40s?
Women spies, I mean, there have been women spies throughout history, from Mata Hari, through on. But when we refer to women spies, we're often really talking about agents. We're talking about people who were recruited often to do a very specific job. Ursula is different in the sense that she was a trained intelligence officer. She took up the role as a career. It's what she wanted to do with her life. And those in 20th century history, women intelligence officers, are incredibly rare. In fact, I don't know of an equivalent anywhere in any service. So in that sense, she was extremely rare. Very early on in her life, in her career as an intelligence officer, she realized that her gender, being a woman and a wife and a mother, was a perfect disguise. And she exploited it ruthlessly throughout her life. She knew that if she baked cakes, went to the local church, wore an apron, lived the life of an apparently ordinary woman, that she would be overlooked. And so she was. I mean, there are these extraordinary documents in the MI5 archives in Britain, the Security Service archives, that show that even when the intelligence services were getting close to Ursula, they knew that there was something going on in this vicinity. They picked up the radio signals. In these documents, and I'm not exaggerating, the men write things like, it can't possibly be Mrs. Burton, as she then was, because she's a mother. She's much too busy with her domestic duties to be a spy. And so therefore, she knew that it was really going to be the perfect camouflage until the end. And really, I think only a woman perhaps would have been able to see through Ursula. And indeed, there was one woman in MI5 who did, I think, rumble what was really going on.
The book is a portrait of Ursula and her actions, but it also describes the 1920s and the 30s and the 40s in a most dramatic way. And you said that she was, like, politically she was shaped by the events of the 20s and 30s in Germany. But what kind of impact did the rest of her life have on her politically? Like, from growing up beside Schlachtensee in Berlin, then traveling to Shanghai, to Poland, then to Britain. I mean, she didn't lead an ordinary life.
She didn't. I mean, it's one of the elements that went into her personality was this restless quest for adventure. All spies, or all interesting spies, tend to describe themselves as driven by a higher cause. And that's true of almost all of them. You know, they want to believe that they are serving something larger than themselves. But it's also true of all spies, in my experience and my research, they're often motivated by other factors as well. And in Ursula's case, they included this restless quest for adventure, a love of danger. I mean, she reveled in the danger, even though not only was her own life at stake, but the life of her children and her family. She knew that if she'd been caught by the Japanese secret police, for example, or the Gestapo, or that her family would have been wiped out. So the stakes were incredibly high. And yet she was sort of impelled. And I think there's one other element that is also common to a lot of spies, and that is a kind of addiction to secrecy. I think spies are both addictive. Secrets are both addictive and toxic. It's very hard to give up secrecy once you've started to live a double life. And Ursula was living a double life. On the outside, she was a perfectly ordinary wife and mother. On the inside, she was something completely different. And I think after a while, she found that very difficult to renounce. The secret club is a very difficult club to leave. She managed it in the end, but for 10 years, I think she was sort of partly intoxicated by the excitement of her own story. And bear in mind that she was in a way a frustrated writer. She always wanted to be a novelist, and she did become a very successful novelist. And so I think in a way, part of the attraction for Ursula was this imaginative way that she could inhabit a kind of artificial world, that she could make up her own world as she went along. And I've always thought that there's not a huge difference between spies and novelists. They do a similar thing. They create an artificial, imaginary world and then try to lure other people into it.
So speaking about novelists, I mean, after researching and writing about like amazing life stories like Ursula's and also in your other books, is it possible to read spy fiction and get kicks out of that as well?
I'm going to take that as a compliment because I love the non-fiction world, because particularly the world of espionage, because in a way being allowed to write these kind of narrative non-fiction stories which are true, I get to invade the territory that is normally occupied by spy novelists or novelists in general. Stories about loyalty and love and betrayal and adventure and romance. And yet they're all true. If you have the right material, if you can get enough detail, these stories read like novels. And yet every word of them, I never make anything up. You know, it is all there in the record. And I think I'm very lucky in that way. You know, if I was writing economic history, it would be much less interesting and exciting to read. But I still love spy fiction. And my writing is factual, all of it, but it is nonetheless, I think, informed by novelists and novelistic techniques. So I use novelistic techniques. I'll use cliffhangers and moments of suspense, and but nonetheless, they are not novels. They are accurate, as I hope, as accurate as I can make them to the reality of the time. So I still read a lot of spy fiction. I love it.
Do you have any favorites?
Well, I mean, John le Carré, who was a friend of mine, the late John le Carré, David Cornwell, had a very profound influence on me. I mean, we became good friends, and in some ways, I suppose he was a sort of mentor for me. And I still think his novels, particularly the early novels, have a kind of psychological depth to them and an intensity that removes them from the genre. They're not really spy novels. They are works of great, intelligent, thoughtful political literature. I think they go to a different level. So he is still, for me, the standout favorite in this world. He is that nobody, to coin a phrase, nobody does it better. You know, he was absolutely brilliant at this. So he's still my favorite.
A couple of final questions. One of your earlier books, Operation Mincemeat, which was a huge success, has now been made into a movie with Colin Firth playing the lead role, and it will finally premiere now in 2021. It's been delayed a little bit because of the pandemic. Have you seen the final results?
I have, yes. In fact, I've been quite closely involved in the making of Operation Mincemeat. They've been very generous in allowing me to kind of put my pennyworth in. They've done an unbelievably good job. I mean, Colin Firth plays this part magnificently. It's a very strange story. I mean, it's a wonderful story about. It's again a completely true story about a wartime deception where the British, to try to bamboozle and confuse the Germans, got a dead body and gave him a false identity and shipped it ashore where they knew that a German spy was operating, and it was astoundingly successful. And there are some wonderful performances in the film. It's Colin Firth is brilliant, but Matthew McFadden plays he's the sort of second lead, and Kelly MacDonald, brilliant Scottish actress, plays one of the women involved in the plot, and it's and they've managed to capture that extraordinary wartime texture, and yet it's very funny. I mean, it manages to be both an adventure story and a love story, and yet a kind of war story, and yet it is also tremendously comic in parts. I mean, it nearly goes fantastically wrong, and so it's really a wonderful achievement, I think.
You've written about spying during the Second World War and the Cold War. Do you see any parallels to the modern world of espionage, or is it just two completely different worlds with the Cold War then and the digital spying now?
We would imagine that really it's transformed, that it's a completely different world. It really isn't. I mean, although modern intelligence is based very much on what we're doing now, you know, it's all about signals intelligence. It's about intercepting text messages and emails and so on. That's known in the trade as signals intelligence, as opposed to human intelligence, where it is about, you know, extracting information from individuals. Nonetheless, the two sides of intelligence complement each other, as they always have. And signals intelligence on its own doesn't work. I mean, you know, it's just as easy to lay a false trail in what we're doing today as it is in any other way. You know, you can confuse. So you still need human intelligence. And it's the kind of balance between the two that is still the essence of how modern intelligence works, and always has. You need, you know, during the war, signals intelligence was about intercepting wireless messages and decoding them at Bletchley Park, for example. But it was also about the human beings who, it boils down in the end to one human being looking at another human being and trying to work out if they're telling you the truth or not. That's still the essence of espionage. And whether you do it by signals or whether you do it face to face, it is the same process, I think. And the two elements really go together, and one without the other simply doesn't work. So I think these stories still have huge modern relevance. And I'm very struck by the way that modern intelligence services are very interested in their own history. I give a lot of talks to the FBI, the CIA, the intelligence services around the world, MI5, MI6, and they know, they've come to realize that understanding how the system works today, you need to understand how it worked in the past, because they're not so far apart. So they're great students of their own history, spies.
One final question. What kind of stories are you looking at the moment? Are there any other Agent Sonyas out there? Stories that need to be told that you're working on? What can we expect from Ben Macintyre next?
Well, to answer your question, I think there are other Agent Sonya stories out there, partly because I think the role of women in intelligence has been badly neglected. And I think what stories there are tend to be rather straightforward, sort of hagiographic celebrations of women, brave women doing it. Actually, there are some very important women's stories to be done. My next book is actually, I'm moving away a little from espionage. I will come back, I suspect, but I'm currently writing the history of Colditz prisoner of war camp. Colditz was the great POW camp in Germany during the war, where lots of people of lots of different nationalities, officers mostly, were gathered because they were all escapers. And it's a wonderful story about escape and bravery and daring do, but it's also a kind of wonderfully enclosed theater of how men, mostly men, entirely men, in fact, in that context, behave in this very constrained world. And it turns out to be a story really about class and race and opportunity and character. And it asks the question, if you were locked up in this prisoner of war camp in 1942, what would you do? And I love it. It's a wonderful theater, much of it very comic and some of it frankly absurd, but a lot of it really fascinating, I think.
We're looking forward to be reading this next story from you, and just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to chat a little bit with us at the Oslo Crime Festival. And til alle våre seere her I Norge, så må vi jo si at det en haugavis med andre program du kan se her på Krimfestivalen. Det vel rundt om 50 forskjellige poster. Så sjekk gjerne ut noen av dem når du ferdig med å se på dette intervjuet med Ben Macintyre. Takk!